Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, the presidential race is heating up, but amid the coronavirus outbreak and its economic fallout, will the president and presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden change their campaigning strategies? Republican National Committee spokesperson Liz Harrington and former Obama economic advisor Robert Wolf discuss the 2020 election, the possibility of another stimulus package, and the state of the economy. And as states ease COVID-19 restrictions, cases of the virus are still surging in the U.S. Dr. Amesh Adalja, a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security, weighs in on how this uptick in infections could impact the nation's plans to reopen. Plus commentary from Fox Nation host Abby Hornacek. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
I'm Martha McCallum.
I'm David Asman, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, June 24th, 2020. I'm Dave Anthony. President Trump hit the road again, campaigning in Arizona, as Republicans keep pushing back on polls showing him trailing Joe Biden.
I see the methodology in all of these mainstream polls, the vast majority are just wrong. And it's the same thing that he did in 2016.
I'm Lisa Brady. From beaches to bars, the crowds are coming back across America, sometimes leaving masks and social distancing behind.
We are going to see more cases, more hospitalizations, and more deaths until there is a vaccine. And we can't behave as if the virus isn't out there.
And I'm Abby Hornacek. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
For the second time in 4 days, President Trump left Washington, this time going to Yuma, Arizona.
My administration has done more than any administration in history to secure our southern border. Our border has never been more secure.
He inspected border wall under construction, now up to 200 miles.
Illegal immigration is down 84% from this time last year.
The president later went to a church in Phoenix that was packed, full of students who are Trump supporters.
The president loves to get outside the swamp and meet directly with the American people.
Liz Harrington is spokesperson for the Republican National Committee and says the wall is an important issue still.
I think a lot of liberal media outlets have stopped talking about this issue because they can't say that the wall is not going up, because we have completed over 200 miles and there will be over 500 miles by the end of 2021. So that's a major accomplishment. The president is committed to securing the border, really prioritizing American citizens first, which has always been such a central part to rebuilding our country, rebuilding our economy, and the promises President Trump made in 2016 that he continues to deliver on.
But the president has been called, when it comes to his immigration policy, when it comes to what's happened with all the protests across the country, he's been called a racist by so many people. How does he deal with that, and how do you deal with that to counter those kinds of words used against him?
Well, it's the same playbook, unfortunately. Democrats and the media always call Republicans these horrible smears when they can't win the argument. And we saw it in 2016, Hillary Clinton just calling us deplorable and irredeemable. That playbook hasn't changed. And President Trump, he weathers it. He focuses on what's more important, which is uplifting the ideals that we have in common. And it's uplifting the history of the country that we can learn from, but also adhere to those founding principles of equality under the law, equal opportunity, our rights guaranteed by God, not by government. And I think this election is really going to show that dividing contrast. On the one hand, you have Democrats unable to distance themselves from members of their own party, calling for lawlessness and defunding and dismantling of the police, not taking a stand against unruly mobs that are destroying public and private property. And then a president who is for law and order, but also justice and fairness and restoring peace and prosperity.
The decline was severe during the coronavirus worst moments in March and April, but during the biggest parts of the shutdown, millions and millions of jobs were lost, and obviously the economy took a big hit. The president has even said that they may have to have some more economic stimulus, so we're not out of the woods yet economically, and obviously how things are in the fall, we don't know yet. So what will the president be saying to contrast the arguments that he was in charge when things went bad in March and April?
Certainly unprecedented to have the greatest economy in generations completely just shut down. I mean, it's completely unprecedented. You've never said, hey, don't go to work. And it's all because of the pandemic from communist China. That regime hid this virus from the world, and the entire world, not just the country, has faced the brunt of those decisions made by the Chinese Communist Party. But what the Democrats and the media are discounting is the resilience of the American people and the strength and the fundamentals of that economy that are so strong going into this. It's a completely different environment back in 2008 and 2009.
Before the president left for Arizona, he talked to reporters outside the White House discussing Saturday's rally.
We had a nice crowd, but we had the highest ratings in the history of Fox on Saturday night.
Though there were reports he was angry the arena had empty seats. The president was asked about what he said that night, that he had asked to slow down testing as the coronavirus surges in many states. Now, his campaign and White House press secretary later said that was in jest an attempt at humor.
I don't kid. Let me just tell you, let me make it clear. We have got the greatest testing program anywhere in the world.
But he called it a double-edged sword.
In one way, it tells you have cases. In another way, you find out where the cases are, and you do a good job.
Well, 8 of the cases were Trump campaign staffers who got the virus in Oklahoma. Amid criticism, people were too close, and many weren't masked.
When the protest came over the George Floyd killing, and when those were hijacked by radical elements and descended into riots, where was the government? Where was the lecture about social distancing? Where were the public health concerns? And they weren't there. So much of this, unfortunately, from the Democrat side has been political. President Trump has been interested in delivering for the American people what's best for us. And people do want to get out there. I think you've seen a lot of Republican governors giving their citizens the flexibility and the respect they deserve to make these decisions for themselves. We've learned a lot about this virus. We've learned things that can protect the most vulnerable. That's what we always should have focused on.
In Oklahoma and Arizona, these 2 states that the president's been to in the last couple of days, there has been record numbers of coronavirus cases, and in Arizona, a record number of hospitalizations. Would you and would the Trump campaign be wanting more social distancing at rallies, wanting more people to wear masks?
In Tulsa, they had hand sanitizer. They did do temperature checks to try to limit anyone that was symptomatic going into the facility, and they handed out masks for anyone to wear as they see fit. We think that trust in the American people is so important, and let Americans really make these decisions, and that's still within the guidance. So we think as more and more states are becoming fully open, people have learned a lot about how to do that safely.
President Trump has trailed in a lot of different polls, whether they're national or some of the battleground states. The Trump campaign and the president continue to say the polls are wrong and they're broken. What is it about polling? This dates back to 2016. What is it about polling that Republicans think is going wrong?
I see the methodology in all of these mainstream polls, the vast majority are just wrong. And it's the same thing they did in 2016 that showed Hillary Clinton up by 12 points or 10 points. They're not finding people that are actually likely voters, and they're almost always oversampling Democrats. A recent Reuters poll polled 10% more Democrats than Republicans. So when you're asking 10% more Democrats than Republicans, you're probably going to see a 10% bigger gap. That's not what the electorate is going to look like on November 3rd.
Now we thank Liz Harrington from the Republican National Committee and shift gears to Joe Biden, who held a virtual fundraiser Tuesday with his old boss for the first time, former President Obama. After, the ex-vice president put out a statement very critical of President Trump's trip to Arizona, calling the wall expensive and ineffective, adding it was reckless and irresponsible for the president to hold a rally in Phoenix. Biden says his corona response is a failure and the attempt at recovery corrupt. Robert Wolf is a former Obama economic advisor, now a Fox News contributor.
I'm one of those who's rooting for the economy. I'm not one of those that wants us to go into a recession and have more people unemployed because that's politically favorable to Joe Biden. I'm not that way. I ran a bank. Okay, so I've always been a capitalist. My opinion is very clearly, we are in a recession. I don't think the recovery has been the V-shape that this administration's been talking about. It's too early to tell. I was very clear on Fox that President Trump and his advisors spiking the football is incredibly premature. We still have over 20 million more unemployed people since the pandemic begun. We need to figure out how to come together to do a CARES Act 4.0. We need to keep small businesses vibrant.
Now, spending clearly is important. It's a big part of economic growth. If you have a lot of people out of work, the spending, I know we had a jump up in May. Do you see that as sustainable, June and July? Do you think that is possible to keep it going where we have big rises back up?
Yes, the retail sales number was good, but it's off an incredibly low base. But also, what was interesting is a larger proportion of the middle and lower class spent more money, and middle and upper class spent less money versus the norm on retail sales. So it definitely tells you that these benefits from the CARES Act were helpful. We should look at things like rebates. So when people spend money, maybe they get a tax rebate. So we actually do something, what I would say, more on the demand side of the consumer.
You mentioned small businesses. A lot of them got loans, but that money is going to run out. And if we have restaurants only allowed to be half full, and you don't have as many people going to gyms and salons and all those kinds of things, do we need to give them more money?
Yeah, I mean, I've been clear all along, Dave. I thought that the payroll protection program was way too small. We only gave to about 12% of small businesses. And so we know that we didn't literally give to near enough.
Historically, it's not easy for a president to be reelected in a bad economy. If you're the Biden campaign, is that still what you hammer at the most?
I think there's a few things. One, I think independent voters, if you look at recent Fox polls, they're looking to come back to some sort of normalcy. I think people are getting exhausted by waking up and going to sleep to the Twitter president. I just think it's exhausting. So one, I do think that Biden is doing better with independents and moderates. A lot of it will be on who's better to take us into a recovery. And I think that the president trickle-down economics really didn't work.
Well, he has said that the economy was roaring like it never had been before until the coronavirus took it down. Obviously, you don't see it that way.
Well, that's just not factual, because we've had GDP much greater than 3% many, many times in many, many years, right? I think GDP under this president has been under 2.5%. So one, those numbers aren't accurate. Number two, with respect to wages have gone up, not even where inflation has been. Number three, if you look at, yes, the unemployment rate was great, don't get me wrong, and I'm glad it was great. But if you look at jobs numbers, President Obama's last 2 years were better than President Trump's first 2 years on jobs.
There have been some that have feared that the Biden campaign will be hijacked by the too far left of the party and turn off maybe independent voters. Do you see that as possible or not?
Well, there's no question that our party overall has shifted left. Joe Biden's not a socialist at all. I believe the Democratic Party is a pro-business party. I think we just look at business that should be actually fair to all, and we shouldn't have the income inequality and wealth inequality we have today.
Robert Wolf, we really thank you very much for your time today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Dave.
This is Abby Hornacek with your Fox News commentary coming up.
It's beginning to sound a little like March. States pleading with residents to help stop the spread of coronavirus.
COVID-19 is now spreading at an unacceptable rate in Texas. and it must be corralled.
Governor Greg Abbott urging people to social distance, wear masks, and even stay home as the state tops 5,000 new cases of the virus in a single day. He had been one of the Republican governors who seemed to side with the president's argument about ramped up testing.
By having more tests, we find more cases. We did 25 million tests.
But White House Task Force member Dr. Anthony Fauci told a House hearing Tuesday the rising numbers of cases are troublesome.
We're now seeing a disturbing surge of infections that looks like it's a combination, but one of the things is an increase in community spread.
He also remains cautiously optimistic about the chance for a vaccine by early next year or even late this year. But for now, a recent surge continues in more than 20 states.
I am concerned about the surge, but my concern is different depending upon the state and on the local dynamics.
Dr. Amesh Adalja is an infectious disease physician and a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security.
We do know that as people interact, it's inevitable that you're going to see more cases. The question always becomes, are those cases manageable? In places where the percent positivity of tests that are returning positive is increasing, that's where I'm more worried. And I'm also worried about places where hospital capacity seems to be under stress. Like, for example, we heard in Arizona and Montgomery, Alabama. Those are the markers I look at. So it's not universal across the country as we see new cases, but in those certain places that are becoming new hotspots where we're worried about kind of spiraling a little bit out of control, that's where my concern lies.
I know what you mentioned about the positivity rate is very important because some officials, including the president, keep trying to make the argument that cases are rising because the U.S. is doing so much testing. I mean, is there any truth to that?
No, we are doing more testing, but the number of positive cases is rising faster than our rise in testing. So that tells you that there is transmission going on. And if you look even as a nation at the percent positivity, it had been below 5% for some time. It is now going above 5%. Even as testing, as testing goes up, it shouldn't be going up at that level. You would expect it to still stay low if there wasn't increased transmission. And when you look at some of the places, for example, that we're really concerned about, like Arizona, the percent positivity of tests went from below 10% to around 20% now. That's concerning. That tells you that there are chains of transmission that are ongoing that are not being managed by case contact investigation, that they might be unrecognized chains of transmission. And what we worry about is those chains spilling into hospitals and putting them under stress. And indeed, we're hearing about that in Arizona, that there is stress on their hospitals. And this really argues that we need to get aggressive with our case contact finding in those places where test positivity is going up.
Do we have a sense of what is driving this increase right now? Is the timing because of the wave of states that eased restrictions around Memorial Day?
It really has to do with a lot of things, but that is part of it. I think it's important to remember that when we had enforced social distancing by the states, that was really to preserve hospital capacity. It wasn't about the virus going away. And when those lifted, it didn't mean that the virus was gone. The virus is going to be with us in every one of our activities until there is a vaccine. And I think that's something that's lost on people, that when you go out and do things, when you interact with people, there is going to be a non-zero risk of transmission. And as we see people doing that, you're going to see more cases. Hopefully the cases can be kept to a level that our case contact investigators can deal with them so that they don't set off chains of transmission that end up putting us into problems in hospitals. But that's not always going to be the case if we don't have properly resourced health departments. So I do think that there's a lot of things going on at once right now. There is some more testing going on, for example, in jails and in meatpacking plants, but that's not the whole picture. It really has to do with people socially interacting. And that's why you're seeing this skewing in the data with younger individuals getting diagnosed now, because those are the first people who are venturing out now because they're less risk averse than older populations who might have pre-existing conditions. So it's all fitting with more social interaction, more mobility, causing more cases to spread. And I think that's going to be the new normal. And it really speaks to the fact that we need to get control of these cases through aggressive case management.
Yeah, and I guess people should also not take this as a sign that masks and social distancing don't work, right? Instead, it's because people aren't doing them enough.
Exactly. I think this is something that people have to learn to live with. They have to adjust to to being in environments where this virus is always going to be a risk, either a risk that you're going to transmit it or a risk that you're going to acquire it. And you still need to be mindful of social distancing, washing your hands frequently, not touching your face coverings as needed. All of that's going to be part of how we move forward with this pandemic virus until there is a vaccine. And I think what happens is that out of sight, kind of out of mind, when people see that green for restaurants and bars opening, they forget that there is still going to be a risk there that is sizable, and we want to make sure that we don't put our hospitals into crisis. So people still need to be responsible. People really need to think about their contacts and think about what's essential to them, what's not essential to them, and try and practice the best social distancing they can, even if they want to go to a restaurant or a bar.
Florida's another one of the surge states, one of only 7 nationwide to top 100,000 cases, and packed bars are getting some of the blame.
What we've seen, particularly over the last week, is a real explosion in new cases amongst our younger demographics.
Governor Ron DeSantis says bars and restaurants that don't follow limits on capacity will face a temporary shutdown. The mayor of Miami is making masks mandatory, a step some other cities and states have taken. And Louisiana's governor is among those tapping the brakes on the next phase of reopening. This makes talk of a fast-track vaccine all the more tantalizing. But how realistic is that?
I think it's always been overly optimistic. It's in the realm of possibility, but it would be really record-breaking to have a vaccine developed that quickly. Vaccine development is something we usually measure in years, not in months. And although we're taking really breathtaking steps to get a vaccine developed quicker, we're already in phase 3 clinical trials, which is unheard of, using new technologies that didn't exist even 10 years ago. I do think it's something that we don't want to wed ourselves to. We don't want to say that we're going to have a vaccine by a certain date and then miss that deadline, because invariably there's going to be hiccups in production when you're trying to make vaccine to do the whole U.S. population or the whole world population. So I do think we have prepared to face this virus without a vaccine. I think we will have a vaccine. There's no biological barrier to having a vaccine. We have animal coronavirus vaccines that are highly successful in the veterinary world. It's just a question of, can we get the data necessary to say that this is a safe and effective vaccine in the fastest possible time period? And I think that's always going to be a concern when you're doing something on such a grand scale. And hopefully we do get batches of the vaccine by the end of the year. But I don't think that it's something that I would completely guarantee will happen.
Well, where does that leave us then for something like the start of the school year this fall? I mean, some districts are definitely planning at this point to at least try to open. But, what would it take for you to be telling them, no, you shouldn't? Or would you already be saying that?
Schools they were closed basically reflexively because of extrapolations from influenza. And we're finding that this virus behaves very differently than influenza. In influenza, children are major magnifiers of infection, and we're not seeing that so much with this virus. We're not hearing about epidemics that are being started or outbreaks being started or driven by children. We know that there have been schools already open in the United States in places like Montana and Idaho, and they seem to be operating okay. We know some countries didn't close schools, and we also know that daycare centers for essential workers were open throughout this pandemic, and we haven't heard about outbreaks there. So I think that when it comes to opening schools, because children are relatively spared from the epidemiology of this, meaning they don't transmit it, they don't seem to be driving outbreaks, and they seem to be spared from severe cases, I do think this is something that's one of the first things that probably can open, and I do think we will see schools being open. I think this should be a separate decision regarding other things because children have such a unique role here. Obviously, we have to protect the vulnerable populations that might be in schools, like teachers or ancillary personnel that might be in high-risk groups. But I do think that we can probably have school in a modified fashion because you have to remember that there are major societal costs to having schools closed. Many children get their meals from schools. Many children, especially as stay-at-home orders are lifted, are going to congregate outside of schools and kind of defeat the purpose of it. And you have to remember that most of this distance learning that's gone on has not been very successful. If you look at the nation as a whole, it's been very difficult for students to actually learn. I think there are real psychosocial costs to the system that we're doing right now, which is really magnifying differences between school districts and resources between school districts. So I do think that schools are a separate decision, and I think based on all the data we have now on children and their role in this infection, I do think it's likely something that can be done safely and should be done.
Do you think, Doctor, that people are concerned enough about this virus? And I ask because some people are so willing to sit in a restaurant or a bar or on a plane, for that matter, and others won't even consider those things until there's a vaccine. Are we worried enough? Are we concerned enough?
So I do think that there's different ways that people can try and incorporate this new virus into their everyday risk calculation. And I think it's going to be different for each person because each person, as we know from every activity in life, has a different risk tolerance. And some people are very risk averse and some people are very risk tolerant. And there are susceptibilities to severe disease. We know that this virus doesn't hit people equally and that there are people that are vulnerable, that are older, that have other medical conditions, that are more likely to be hospitalized and have a severe case. And there are other people who may not have any symptoms at all. And I think that's kind of conditioning how people think about this virus. But from a public health or an infectious disease physician standpoint, I do think we cannot emphasize enough that this is still going to be a major challenge from an infectious disease standpoint. And we are going to see more cases, more hospitalizations, and more deaths until there is a vaccine. And we can't behave as if the virus isn't out there. It doesn't mean that we have to go to a Wuhan-style lockdown, but it means that people have to try to find a balance, a way to reduce the harm from this virus by taking common sense precautions to try and prevent yourself from getting infected or spreading this or becoming part of a chain of transmission. And I think we can do it safely, but people have to realize that they cannot behave as if the virus is not there and not expect to suffer the consequences of that.
Dr. Amesh Adalja from Johns Hopkins, thank you so much for your time.
Sure, thank you for having me.
Download and make it Hammer Time with Bill Hammer.
Trey Gowdy, welcome. So if the department is going to start making public investigations about people that you don't even have enough information to charge, that is a slippery slope.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Abby Hornacek.
What's on your mind?
The census. It's that thing that you get in the mailbox every 10 years that you think you probably should fill out, but then it slips your mind, and then you get busy. Then 2 months later, you find it stuffed in your drawer. It is so easy to let the census come and go without filling in your data. But after my chat with the folks over at the U.S. Census Bureau for my podcast, Getting Schooled, I learned some things that definitely encouraged me to get mine in the mailbox, so I thought I'd share. Look, this was my first year filling in the census. 10 years ago, I was 16 years old, so my mom definitely helped me out with that one. But as I've gotten older, I think there's a common fear about giving away your information to the government. So I can understand that in a world of heightened transparency, why people might be a little weary of giving away their personal information. But something I learned from Virginia Heyer, who is the spokeswoman over at the Census Bureau, was all employees of the Census Bureau actually take an oath for life to promise to keep any personal information or data they collect private. Plus, the reality is, the census has changed a lot since Thomas Jefferson instituted it back in 1790. During the Great Depression, the Census Bureau asked a lot of questions about a given household's financial status due to the widespread poverty at the time. But now, as you've seen if you've filled out a census, the questions are geared towards a wide variety of topics. The reality is, you're not just helping the government, you're helping yourself and your community by filling it out. Everyday citizens can use the census to enhance their own understanding of their communities. For example, let's say you were interested in, opening a bike shop, right? You could look at the data the U.S. Census Bureau has on how many people bike to work in your area. That way, you could find out where the highest density for need is and then maximize your opportunity and profit. Also, the constitutional basis for conducting the decennial census is to reapportion the House of Representatives. So, by filling out your census, you're actually helping decide how many of the 435 seats in the House your state gets. And just to be clear here, I do not work for the census, and I have no skin in the game of whether or not you fill out your census. But if you're looking to improve your community and get the right amount of representation in the House of Representatives, you might want to go back into that drawer and dig out your census and get it in the mail. Plus, who doesn't love some data? I'm Abby Hornacek.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust, and click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.